"You looking for work?" he asked. Rhiannon blinked up at him. Her voice barely reached the air. "Isn't everyone?" He studied her, the way some men study an engine before they decide if it's worth fixing. There was no pity in his eyes, just a quiet calculation. The fog thickened between them, heavy enough to make the world feel small. Caleb tilted his head toward the flyer. "What can you do that a machine can't?" It wasn't mockery. It was a test. And for the first time in months, Rhiannon felt something stir behind her ribs. Not hope exactly, but motion. She hesitated, then stood, the damp bench groaning beneath her. The folded paper slipped from her hand and drifted into a shallow puddle. She left it there. Whatever future was written on that page, it had already come and gone. "I can fix the things people give up on," she said. Caleb nodded once, almost to himself. "Then come on." He didn't wait for her to answer, just turned and started back down the foggy stretch of road, boots scraping the wet concrete. Rhiannon watched him go, then followed, her reflection fractured in the water that streaked along the gutter, half shadow, half light, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't running away from something. She was walking toward it. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I'd love to say hello and see just how far our story travels. The fog never really lifted that morning. It just thinned in places, enough for the street lamps to cast halos instead of circles. Enough for Rhiannon to make out the shape of Caleb's shoulders as he pushed open the rusted gate of Sterling Auto. He didn't speak again after that first question, didn't look over his shoulder to be sure she was following. She almost turned back twice, but there was something in the air, a rhythm between rain drips and boot steps, that made her keep going. The shop sat at the edge of town where the street gave way to old logging roads. Its sign creaked in the cold wind, the paint half peeled, the name barely legible. Sterling Automotive and Repairs. Inside, the light was dim and yellowed, humming from a single fluorescent tube that flickered whenever the compressor kicked on. The smell was a living thing. Oil, sawdust, rust, and something faintly burnt that stuck to the back of her throat. Caleb walked past a row of dented tool chests and stopped by an old tractor engine set on blocks. "Been sitting there 3 months," he said. "No one's been able to get it running. You fix it, you stay. You don't, you find the next bench." Rhiannon blinked at him, unsure if he was serious. "Stay where?" He shrugged, wiping his hands with a rag that only spread the grease around. "Room above the shop. Used to store carburetors, but I cleaned it out after Marin outgrew the crib. It ain't much, but it's warm and it's dry." "Why me?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Because you didn't ask for sympathy. And that was it. No handshake, no promise. Just the clatter of tools as he walked away, leaving her in the company of the silent machine." Rhiannon rolled up the sleeves of her denim jacket. Her fingers were stiff, but they remembered. Bolts, metal, torque, the language of weight and leverage. She let the rhythm return, one part at a time. Disassemble, observe, breathe, rebuild. The work slowed her pulse. It silenced the voices in her head that kept telling her she was done for. By dusk, her hair was damp with sweat, and the whole place smelled of old diesel and second chances. She turned the ignition wires back into place, adjusted the coil, gave the key a try. The engine coughed once, then twice, and settled into a low, rough purr. Caleb looked up from across the bay. The faintest shadow of a grin passed across his face. "Guess that settles it." She wiped her hands on her jeans. "Guess it does." He pointed toward the stairs in the corner. "You'll find clean sheets in a box up there. Water's touchy, so don't let it run long." She climbed the narrow wooden staircase, every step groaning beneath her weight. The room was small and mostly empty except for a cot, a narrow window, and the faint smell of cedar that hadn't faded from when it was storage. She dropped her jacket on the cot and sat. Outside, she could still hear the distant hum of the engine downstairs. It was steady, reliable. It sounded like breathing. That night, as she lay under a thin blanket, Rhiannon realized it was the first time in months that she hadn't slept outdoors. The wind brushed against the window pane, but it didn't sound angry. It whispered instead, soft and rhythmic, like a lullaby. She closed her eyes and dreamed of nothing for the first time in a long while. When morning came, Caleb was already up, oil smudged on his brow and coffee steaming beside a cracked radio that played old country songs. He nodded toward a mug. "Didn't know how you take it." "Black's fine," she said. It burned her tongue, but she didn't mind. "You were quiet," he said after a moment. "Most people fill the air with talk. Most people don't listen to the engines," she replied. "They tell you what they need." That made him smile, just a little. "You sound like my old man." From then on, the days fell into a rhythm. She fixed transmissions, valves, and carburetors, and in exchange, Caleb paid her in meals and time. It wasn't charity. It was balance, and that mattered more than he knew. One morning, a soft knock came at the bottom of the stairs. A small voice followed. "Daddy said breakfast's ready." Rhiannon looked down. A little girl stood there in a flannel shirt 2 sizes too big, her hair in a messy braid. Marin held a screwdriver in one hand like it was treasure. "You must be Marin," Rhiannon said. The girl nodded solemnly. "You fixed the tractor." "I heard it." "That I did." Marin grinned. "Can you show me how?" Rhiannon hesitated. She hadn't been around children in years. She wasn't sure what words went with kindness anymore. But Marin waited, patient and hopeful, so she set down the wrench and crouched. "You start by listening," she said, gently tapping the metal. "Engines are like people. They don't always break the same way twice." From that day on, Marin followed her everywhere. She named the shop cat, built miniature gearboxes out of spare parts, and asked questions faster than Rhiannon could answer. At night, when the sky cleared, they sat outside the garage, looking up through the fog at whatever stars could pierce the clouds. Marin loved naming them, even when she got the names wrong. "That one's Orpheus," she'd say, pointing. "The one who tried to fix what was broken." Rhiannon never corrected her. Caleb would watch them sometimes from the doorway, arms folded, a quiet warmth behind his eyes. He never said much, but the small things spoke loud enough. A second coat left by the stairs, a plate kept warm, a light left on. It wasn't until a week later that the quiet broke. The black sedan appeared one afternoon, purring low as it pulled up to the curb. Rhiannon saw it through the fogged window while she was teaching Marin how to measure spark gap. The car didn't belong here. It was too clean, too deliberate. 2 men stepped out wearing coats too heavy for the weather. One looked bored. The other didn't blink much. Caleb stepped out of the bay before they knocked. "You're lost," he said flatly. The taller man smiled without warmth. "We're looking for Rhiannon Halloway, former lead engineer of Orbis West Industrial. Seems she left us some unfinished business." Rhiannon froze. The wrench slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor. Caleb's jaw tightened. "She's busy. This won't take long," the man said. "We just want to make sure you're aware of the liability you've invited onto your premises." He handed Caleb a folded document stamped with a seal. "She's under investigation for theft of intellectual property. Anything she repairs here may be considered derived from those assets." "She doesn't steal," Caleb said. The man shrugged. "That's not what the paperwork says." They left as quietly as they came, but their presence lingered, a dark fingerprint on the air. Rhiannon sat against the wall after they were gone, her face pale and distant. "I should have told you," she whispered. "Told me what?" She drew a slow breath. I wasn't just an engineer. I designed the automation servos that took half the county's jobs. When I found out they planned to use them overseas to break more people, I leaked the data. They blacklisted me after that. Said I was unstable, dangerous. Guess the title stuck. Caleb studied her for a long moment, grease-streaked hands still at his sides. You should have run if they were after you. I'm tired of running. He nodded once. Then we won't. That night, the fog rolled in thicker than before, wrapping the shop in silver silence. Caleb stayed downstairs long after the lights went out, tightening bolts that didn't need tightening. Rhiannon lay awake upstairs, listening to the faint thrum of music from his old radio, the one with half the dial gone. Each note hummed through the floorboards like a heartbeat, steady, stubborn, alive. In the morning, Marin brought up 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. She placed one in Rhiannon's hands and whispered, Daddy says sometimes when bad people come, good people build louder. Rhiannon smiled weakly. He said that. Sort of, Marin admitted. I might have changed the words. Rhiannon looked out the window at the first thin streak of sun cutting through the cloud, catching on the help wanted sign still hanging crooked in the old storefront across the street. She realized she wasn't that sign anymore. She was the answer to it. And somewhere below, in the hum of the waking shop, a new rhythm started. A rhythm built not from fear or loss, but from hands that refused to quit. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to say hello and see how far our story travels. It rained for 3 days straight after the men in the black sedan came. The kind of slow, needling rain that seeps into everything. Wiring, floorboards, bone. The shop felt smaller. Every sound was sharper. Caleb moved through his work with quieter steps, as if the wrong noise might summon those men again. Marin seemed to sense it too. Her questions dried up, replaced by long stretches of silence in which she watched the adults and tried to read the air between them. Rhiannon kept working, fixing carburetors, tuning engines, sorting bolts by thread width, anything to keep her mind from sorting through the rest. But at night, lying in the small cot above the garage, she stared at the ceiling and knew running would be easier. She'd done it before. Pack the jacket, the few dollars saved, move on north. Nobody would follow her into the pines. She even stood at the bus stop once, just to see what it would feel like to wait again. But the bus hissed to a stop, the driver grunted, and she couldn't lift her foot. Some wires, once soldered, don't come undone clean. That night she found Caleb sitting in the shop, elbows on his knees, staring at a half-dismantled transmission like it had personally failed him. The single overhead bulb hummed, throwing long shadows that barely softened the edges of his face. They'll be back, she said quietly. He didn't look up. Figured that. I should leave before they try again. You think that fixes it? It keeps you clear. He finally met her eyes, tired but steady. You didn't start this kind of fight. They did. You told me you can fix the things people give up on. Maybe that includes yourself. She laughed without humor. I didn't tell you the whole story. He leaned back, waiting, not forcing. I worked for Orbis West Industrial, she began. 7 years in. Designed efficiency systems, robotic servos for assembly plants. I thought it was progress until I learned what they'd built from my blueprints. Machines meant to replace 400 people in a town smaller than this one. They wanted me to sign patents they could offshore to places where wages were less than the cost of a wrench. I refused. They cut me off, scrubbed my name, said I'd gone unstable after a nervous breakdown. Her voice cracked then, quiet but clean. I turned whistleblower, sent the files to a reporter in Dallas. But the story died before it reached print. They bought it out. Next week, I was homeless, name trashed, friends afraid to answer their doors. And now they're here because I fixed a tractor engine no one else could. Caleb let the silence sit. Outside, rain rasped the tin siding like restless fingers. You did what was right, he said finally. Look where right got me. He stood, wiped his hands, and poured 2 mugs of coffee. Maybe now it gets you further. They worked through that night, side by side in the glow of a single lamp. Rhiannon spread out papers, sketches, the few scrap schematics she'd saved. Caleb called friends who owed him favors, men and women from the steelworks and shipping yards who had stories of their own about what Orbis West had closed down. Between them, they built something that wasn't just defense. It was a map of everything people like her had been forced to lose. At some point, Marin padded down the stairs, hair mussed from sleep, carrying a blanket that was more patched than cloth. She climbed into Rhiannon's lap without a word and fell asleep against her shoulder. Caleb saw it but didn't comment. He just turned another page, the corner of his mouth curving upward in the faintest reflection of peace. By the time dawn filtered through the bay windows, the storm had passed. The world outside was all puddles and silver light, sharp enough to cut through the fatigue that hung in the room. Caleb stretched, neck popping. You ready? Rhiannon exhaled. Not even close. Good. Means you'll keep your guard up. The council hearing was held in the fire station, a long hall with metal folding chairs and burned coffee in the back. Half the town showed up. The men from Orbis West wore suits that gleamed under fluorescent lights, shiny and thin. The townsfolk wore the week's work: grease, rubber, and exhaustion. The lead corporate man stood first. Words like liability, proprietary design, and intellectual theft hung off his tongue like stones. He painted Rhiannon as a ghost from another state, a rogue engineer with a history of damage. Papers shuffled. Heads nodded uncertainly. When he finished, Caleb stood up, slow and deliberate, hands still stained with oil. You got your facts dressed up fancy, he said. But facts don't mean much without the truth behind them. And the truth is we've all been squeezed dry by companies like yours. You talk about liability, well, this woman here fixed half the engines that keep our town running. Machines your company stopped making parts for. If she stole something, it was just the right to work honest. Then Rhiannon rose. The crowd quieted, almost uneasy. Her voice was low but firm. They called me a thief because I pulled back the curtain, because I thought progress shouldn't cost people their purpose. I didn't steal your code, I wrote it. Every line you profit from came from me. You turned it into something meant to erase lives. Her hand trembled slightly as she held up a schematic, marked with her initials. You want proof there? That's my handwriting. You can compare it with your records, the ones you keep scrubbed behind locked drives. You can threaten, but you can't unmake it. A murmur began at the back of the crowd. Mechanics, welders, grocers, the kind of people who had lost work when the machines came. Someone clapped once. Others followed, hesitant at first, then louder, until the sound filled the hall like incoming surf. The mayor cleared his throat. We've heard both sides enough, he said. We'll confer. They stepped out briefly. The pause stretched. The Orbis men whispered among themselves, their sharp suits wilting under the weight of every eye in the room. Rhiannon didn't look at them. She looked at Marin, who sat beside her, chin lifted in fierce, tiny defiance. When the council returned, the mayor's expression gave it away before he spoke. Miss Halloway, he said, you're cleared of all accusations. The shop keeps its license. And Orbis West is free to leave this town the way it found it, standing. The applause this time was rougher, cleaner, not polite, grateful. Later, as dusk slid back over Washington and the fog came in gentle again, Rhiannon sat outside with Caleb while Marin chased the cat along the curb. The street smelled of wet earth and cold metal. He handed her a rag and nodded toward the front of the shop. Got one last thing to finish. She climbed the short ladder, fingers still shaking from the day's weight, and hung the hand-painted sign they'd made the night before. The letters weren't perfect, one stroke thinner, another crooked, but the words caught the remaining light like flame through glass. She stepped back, met Caleb's eyes, and for a moment, they both just stood there, quiet in the slow wash of fog and neon. No promises spoken, no need. The hum of the town carried around them. A generator kicking on, a car door shutting, life beginning again. Rhiannon looked down the road where the bus never stopped, then up to the sign gleaming above her head. Her hands were chapped, her jacket still damp, and her heart, for the first time in years, was steady. Caleb reached for the shop light switch, turning the sign's reflection into gold across the window pane. "Looks good on you," he said. She smiled. "Looks built to last." Subscribe to see where their story goes next, and comment where you're watching from. I'd love to say hello and know how far our stories traveled.